Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack, back again to bring you everything you need to know for Uldaman Mythic Plus for Season 2. In this video, we're going to go over some of the trash pulls that are going to be more likely to wipe your group, the type of damage you need to encounter, and how to be able to take on the bosses. First off, at the start of the dungeon, there's not as much party damage that happens, and it occurs a lot of times much later on in the instance. The beginning of the dungeon is going to have a lot of tank pressure, as you're going to have some of the berserkers, as well as a number of leapers that kind of just jump all over the place. The diseases that get placed onto the tank are only a slow onto them, so if you have the ability to dispel them, great. But you might spend a lot more time as a healer just blasting output into the tank, because there's some very nasty bleeds. You also are going to need your party to be shutting down the Geomancers, because they're going to cast a number of Chain Lightnings, and the Basilisks will put up this Carapace onto themselves, which can be purged, which reduce their damage taken, and those mobs deal a massive amount of damage onto the tank. Keep in mind the Berserker is also going to try to enrage itself, so soothes and purges are excellent at the beginning. A Lost Dwarves fight, there's a number of different abilities, but they're pretty much easily mitigated as long as your tank is going to be facing these bosses against the wall and away from the group. There's a lot of frontals. There's going to be a shield that gets targeted onto one player that they need to stand away from others. There's a defensive bulwark that needs to be interrupted. And there's going to be a number of void zones that spawn when the Vikings hop onto the longboat and start dropping a cannon barrage onto the group. For ranged DPS, try to be standing in the back of the room so you're not placing void zones on top of where the melee want to be standing, because the melee is going to be following underneath the longboat, dropping their void zones and steadily DPSing the boss throughout. But overall, this boss should go down very easily. Leading up to Bromack, you fight more of the same trash mobs, the Geomancers, the Berserkers as well, and Basilisks. And then when you go up onto Bromack himself, he will also spawn adds throughout the encounter that you want to make sure you're staying close in with the tank so that he's able to gather a lot of those mobs more easily. And you do need to kick the Geomancer's Chain Lightning once again. Otherwise, they're going to sit there, Chain Lightning spamming onto your group and dealing quite a lot of party damage. This fight's very simple, that you just need to be able to kill the lightning totem and target swap very rapidly. Once you do, it stuns the boss, and you'll be able to continue DPSing him down from there. And a lot of times, it's just making sure you're not line of sighting anybody in the group as you're switching positions to be able to kill the totems quickly and effectively, and this fight will go down very easily. Once again, moving on to the trash towards Sentinel Talondras, there's going to be more custodians that are placing very heavy bite bleeds onto your tank, and a lot of this area can be either chain pulled or sort of line of sighted to be able to move on into Sentinel Talondras. Now, this boss fight is really all about your tank. The tank needs to be able to remove the stacks of this strength buff that prevents the boss from being stunned. Now, each of the circular orbs that players are dropping is going to stun them, and the boss is also going to be doing a number of stomps about every 10 to 15 seconds, which can knock players back into the stun orbs. So by consuming them, you're very effectively not being able to stun the boss can enrage, and then he will kill you off. So make sure you're placing orbs in the middle of the room so it's easier for the tank to be able to get access to them and kite the boss through those orbs to stun him. And keep in mind as well that the orbs are going to remove the stacks of his strength and sort of like immunity buff, but then once he loses those stacks, you can use a single target or AoE stun like leg sweep or asphyxiate to stun the boss if you don't have orbs to be able to stun him when he's trying to cast his empowerment. After that, he will regularly be casting these stomps, as I mentioned before, and also be putting 8-second bleeds onto multiple party members with like 2 or 3 seconds delay between them. So there are a lot of times you're going to have a stomp into multiple dots getting put out onto players into another stomp. And so making sure you sort of get a litmus test of if the stomp's dealing 50 or 60% of somebody's life, that you're always topping all of the dot players off first before you start worrying about the regular players, because otherwise there's not too much party damage outside of those regular mechanics. While there's very heavy tank damage at the start of the dungeon, it starts becoming even heavier party damage after the Sentinel. You're going to have a number of these Weavers which cast Hail of Stone, which can be stunned, interrupted, disoriented to be able to stop. Then the Warders are going to be casting buffs onto allies that are sort of like an Earth Shield that need to be purged. And overall, there's going to be a number of like small bolt casts that are happening throughout this dungeon. So you can pull a lot and make a lot of your trash percentage right after the Sentinel, but you need to make sure you're weaving and prioritizing or setting up a priority list of AoE stuns, disorients, so that you can continue to interrupt these Weavers, because if you let them full cast these Hails of Stone, it's an immense amount of party damage that you have to be able to deal with. Once you get through those early trash pulls where you can get 15, 20 mobs all together, there's a number of runic protectors that are going to pulse this earthquake damage, which cannot be line of sighted and requires some massive healing, because you're also having Weavers at the same time trying to cast more Hails of Stone. So the DPS and tank need to make sure they're doing everything possible to interrupt those Weavers for the Hail of Stone, and everybody needs to make sure they're standing close by, because even though there are those pillars that can be line of sight, the damage from the Earthquake will go through the line of sight and still damage your party, and having anybody trying to help in line of sight is just going to cause more problems for the healer. Emberon is one of the easiest bosses to wipe on in this dungeon, one of the hardest except for the end boss. He's going to have this Searing Clap, which puts a magic dot on the whole party, which can be mass dispelled or also individually dispelled. If you don't have access to mass dispel as a healer, I'd recommend making sure you dispel some of the melee players, as they're also more likely to get hit by some of the different orbs that are running all around the room and spawning really from some of the ads that you'll see in the corners. Most of the deaths that you're going to have on this encounter are people just getting hit by orbs. There's also going to be the Unstable Embers, which is going to spawn these circles around players and they'll explode after 2 or 3 seconds. And so there's a lot of times where melee are not going to be able to see some of these orbs. They're going to be taking a lot of additional damage and having to move around the other melee players to drop these embers and not hit each other. And so if they also are getting hit by an orb at the same time, they're very, very likely to be killed. At full energy, the boss is going to go into the intermission phase, and if you're in the sort of inner circle of the room, you're going to get knocked back, and again, very easy to get knocked back into these orbs as well. So once you see the boss transition into the middle of the room, whether you're melee or ranged, make sure everybody has a set position they're going to meet up at so that they can dodge away from the different pillars of flame that are going to start cutting off the room, and then steadily be moving around the room, killing off the ads, and pushing it back once again into the first phase. Once you kill off Emberon, you're going to have, once again, more of these golems with a high party damage, and there's some of these pulls that are going to also have guardians that are spawning this sort of blessing of Tyr, which are going to increase the damage of all of the mobs that are inside of it. You also, if you're standing in it yourself, are going to be taking damage. So you're going to make sure you're consistently moving away from that target and trying to prioritize it down when you can. There's also going to be some pulls that are going to be double golems, which is incredibly high AoE damage, similar to like the blueberries you'd see at a Shadowmoon Burial Grounds, but thankfully they're a little desynced, so you do have a little bit of time to be able to top players off before the next burst happens. But if anywhere that you're going to have multiple wipes on from just party-wide healing or lack thereof, it would be at this point. So make sure you have cooldowns at the ready, guidance, whatever sort of defenses on hand that people know. They're very, very easily able to die from this. The warders are also going to be casting curses onto allies that stun them after 5 seconds. These can be interrupted, stunned, disoriented, and it'll put the ability on cooldown. And so if you don't have any curses, it's not really a requirement in this dungeon, but this is a very easy area that players can get killed by it if you're just not having stops on hand. Once you get through the golem section, you're going to have the infinite dragons. If ever there were a spot to make sure you're making use of Shroud or Mind Soothe, which also works on the Dragonkin, it would be at this point, as these guys stack a very large haste reduction that continuously stacks over time, that deals additional dot damage, and buffs all of those dragons. So having a Mass Dispel is insanely helpful. Even Arcane Torrent or just purges and off dispels from maybe like a Warlock pet are also incredibly helpful for this. But keep in mind that ranged DPS can stand at 40 yards and outrange this effect. But that also means you have to continuously be dispelling melee and possibly even using tank externals onto the melee to help keep them alive. If, for example, you're a rogue or a paladin or somebody else that has a way to remove your own debuff effect, try to use it around 8 to 10 stacks because these mobs can live for quite a while. And if you're using Mass Dispel, again, I try to use it around 8 to 10 stacks for the Mass Dispel. But then keeping in mind, if you're going to Mass Dispel and say you're playing as like a Disc Priest, once you get to 8 or 10 stacks, you Mass Dispel, top everybody off, then you're going to need to use something like Barrier or Pain Suppressions to mitigate the damage when players are getting to like 10 or 12 stacks, and then you'll probably be able to Dispel again once you reach somewhere around 14 stacks. So there's really, really heavy damage if you are not max ranging the effect, and even if you are, you still have to make sure you're dispelling the tank and any melee players. Final boss, Chronolord, has a number of really nasty combinations that all sort of derive from the wing buffet that he has. He's going to knock back players, dealing very, very heavy damage, and he's also going to be placing 3 dots onto players that can be dispelled, and they're going to be dropping puddles all over the room. Making sure that players are both staying fairly close together. Once again, if you have a Mass Dispel, it's incredibly good. But even if you do not, you want to make sure that the 2 players that did not get dispelled are standing somewhat close together so you're always able to drop the pools almost on top of each other. When the boss runs out of energy, he's going to start his intermission phase and start sucking up these puddles, and it's just a lot easier for your healers and ranged DPS that are not as mobile to be just planted in one spot, soaking as many puddles as they possibly can all at once. The tank often is going to make sure they're kiting in an area so that the range can stay close by, once again, for dispels and for dropping off puddles, but also during the intermission phase, keeping an eye on the boss's energy so you can drag it almost into the middle of the room so that the melee can start soaking multiple puddles while still being able to DPS the boss and benefiting from the haste buff that they have on hand. Otherwise, dodging sand breath and making sure the group is going to be staying very close together is absolutely imperative. And the easiest area for a lot of players to die is usually after the intermission. Since there's so much ticking damage over this 10-12 second period, the boss will then have his wing buffet right after that phase and then follow it up with more dots onto 3 players. So you have this sort of combination of mechanics that occurs extremely rapidly, and then it's making sure everybody can sort of stay together. Just like in our Halls of Infusion video with Iridius, there's a lot of times that deaths happen naturally because players are far too spread out, and the tank is sort of just over-moving or letting players get sort of cut off, and the fact that they have to like run through sand piles in order to get back to the group and take additional damage on top of that. This boss can be an absolute brutal grind and require a massive amount of healing, so like I said before, off dispels, if you have access to them, are incredibly helpful. Even a Shadow Priest, if they can spec into Improved Mass Dispel, will always have it available for every round of the dot debuffs. And the primary areas you'd want to have people using like extra defensives would be at the middle or later parts of the intermission phase with the haste benefits, so you can mitigate the damage from that intermission and also still have your defensive up for the wing buffet that happens immediately after that. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Hope you all enjoyed it and found it useful, and I'll catch you all next time.